The crystal chandelier cast diamonds of light across the grand ballroom as 300 guests watched in stunned silence. Victoria Whitmore's hand trembled, the Chateau Margaux tilting dangerously in her manicured grip. "People like you are born to serve, not sit at VIP tables," she hissed at the gray-haired man in the modest vest. He sat motionless at table 7, eyes downcast, hands folded, no Rolex, no designer labels, just quiet dignity that somehow enraged her more. "You don't belong here." Victoria's voice rose, sharp as broken glass. The man looked up once. His eyes held something she couldn't name, not anger, but a deep, ancient sadness that made her pause for half a heartbeat. Then she poured. Red wine cascaded over his silver hair, down his face, soaking into the gray fabric. 47 phones rose simultaneously, flashes popping like stars dying. He didn't move, didn't speak. He simply closed his eyes as the wine dripped onto table 7. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Victoria Whitmore had spent 30 years running from a name no one remembered: Martha Hayes. At 55, she lived in a world of crystal and silk, where her past stayed buried beneath designer labels and charity galas. Her 12% stake in Whitmore Industries was worth over $600 million on paper. Her marriage to Richard Whitmore had been strategic, practical, and increasingly cold over the past 5 years. Their daughter Emma, 16, barely spoke to her anymore. What no one knew, not Richard, not Emma, not the society pages that chronicled her every appearance, was that Victoria had once slept in a room with 40 other children, eaten donated bread, and worn second-hand shoes until they fell apart. The scar on her left wrist, always hidden by bracelets, came from a cooking accident at St. Grace Orphanage when she was 9 years old. She'd been adopted at 13 by a wealthy family who gave her everything except permission to remember where she came from. Richard Whitmore sat in his father's office, surrounded by the empire James Whitmore Sr. had built. At 58, he ran an $8 billion defense technology company with precision and distance. He loved his father's memory, but had never quite understood the man too focused on business to notice the locked wooden box that had sat in James's desk drawer for a decade. Richard didn't know his father had another son. He didn't know that James had spent 32 years quietly following a boy's life from the shadows, collecting photographs, writing letters never sent. The Tech Charity Gala was held at the Grandview Hotel in Manhattan, the same building where James Whitmore had died of a sudden heart attack 10 years earlier. Victoria represented Whitmore Industries as a $2 million sponsor. She chose Table 7 for VIP partners, without knowing it had been her father-in-law's favorite spot. 300 guests filled the ballroom: CEOs, investors, politicians, the carefully curated elite. Among them sat a man who traveled from Boston with a singular purpose: David Marshall, 57. Wore the only suit that mattered to him, a gray vest his adoptive father had sewn by hand in 1995. Inside the collar, barely visible, were the words stitched in James Whitmore's uncertain handwriting: "A son I chose, not by blood, but by heart." David had terminal cancer, stage 4. The doctors said 8 months, maybe less. He'd come to this gala to see if the company James built still carried his values, still remembered that people mattered more than profit. He wore no watch because he'd sold his $50,000 Patek Philippe 3 years ago to donate to heart disease research. He sat quietly at table 7, watching, remembering, grieving the father who'd saved him and the sister he'd lost 46 years ago. He didn't notice Victoria approaching until her shadow fell across his plate. The wine dripped from David's hair onto the white marble floor. each drop echoing in the sudden silence. He stood slowly, carefully, as if any quick movement might shatter something more than dignity. An older woman in a server's uniform rushed forward with a towel. "Mr. Marshall, are you—" Margaret began. "You're fired," Victoria snapped, her voice cutting across the ballroom. "How dare you defend this man?" That's when Emma Whitmore stood up from a table across the room, her phone raised high. "Mom," the 16-year-old called out, her voice steady and cold. "This is live. 50,000 people are watching." Victoria's face went white. Her hand dropped to her side, wine glass dangling from numb fingers. But the damage was done. David looked at her once more, those sad, knowing eyes that seemed to see straight through her expensive dress and diamond necklace to something she'd buried long ago. Then he turned and walked out of the ballroom, leaving a trail of red droplets behind him like breadcrumbs leading nowhere. The phones kept flashing. 47 people had captured the moment from different angles. By 9:30 that evening, the video had been posted to 7 different platforms with captions ranging from shocked to gleeful. A tech executive's wife humiliates a man at charity event. Billionaire's wife shows true colors. The hashtag wine of shame began trending within the hour. Victoria sat alone in her bedroom, still wearing the $5,000 gown, watching her phone explode with notifications. 500,000 views, 1 million, 2 million. The messages came in waves, strangers calling her terrible names, threatening her, dissecting her character with surgical precision. By 11 that night, major news outlets had picked up the story. CNN ran the headline, "Charity Gala Turns Ugly as Prominent Socialite Attacks Guest." At 1 in the morning, the number jumped to 15 million views. Someone calling themselves anonymous had found something Victoria thought she'd erased forever. They posted a scanned document adoption papers from 1982 showing that Victoria Ashford, née Whitmore, had been born Martha Hayes, ward of the state, St. Grace Orphanage. The internet erupted with new fury. She'd been poor once. She'd been one of them. And she'd forgotten. Richard sat in his office, tie loosened, staring at an email that had arrived at exactly 3:47 in the morning. The sender was David Marshall. The subject line read simply, "Withdrawal." "Mr. Whitmore," it began. "Your father, James, once told me that the measure of a person is how they treat those who can do nothing for them. Tonight, I witnessed the opposite. I am formally withdrawing TechCore Defense from all negotiations regarding the defense contract. I cannot in good conscience partner with a company that has forgotten its soul. Sincerely, David Marshall, Chief Engineer, TechCore Defense." Richard read it 5 times, his hands shaking. David Marshall. The name meant nothing to him, but the contract meant everything. $1 billion over 10 years, the future of Whitmore Industries. He searched the name and found articles, patents, a respected career. And then he found something else, a small human interest piece from years ago titled, "From St. Grace to MIT, One Man's Journey." There was a photo of David at 38, standing in front of a building Richard recognized. His father had donated millions to St. Grace Orphanage. By 5 that morning, when Asian markets opened, the damage began to show. Investors had seen the video. They'd read the email that someone inside TechCore had leaked to the press. Whitmore Industries stock dropped 18% before trading was halted. When the New York Stock Exchange opened at 9:30, Victoria's world ended in numbers. The stock plummeted 20% in the first 10 minutes. The company's $8 billion valuation shrank to $6.4 billion. By 10, three major partners had sent termination notices. Global Tech canceled its $180 million annual contract. Defense Systems Inc. pulled $150. Federal contracts another $120. $450 million in revenue, gone. At 10:30, the board of directors held an emergency meeting. 7 members sat around the polished mahogany table. 3 of them had sold their shares the day before the gala. Inside information, perhaps, or just rats leaving a sinking ship. They demanded Victoria's immediate termination. Richard called his wife at noon. She appeared in his office doorway, still wearing last night's gown, makeup smeared, hair tangled. She looked like a ghost of herself. He slid 2 documents across his desk. The board wants you to sign the first one. It's your resignation from all positions. He paused, his face unreadable. The second is from my lawyer. Divorce papers. I had them drawn up this morning. Victoria's hand trembled as she reached for a pen. She signed the resignation without reading it. But when she touched the divorce papers, something in her broke. Richard, please. Our daughter won't speak to you, he said quietly. She's staying with her grandmother. She asked me to tell you not to call. By 1 that afternoon, Victoria had lost her title, her role, her family. The stock continued to fall 35% total. The company was worth $5.2 billion now. Her personal shares had dropped from $624 million to $405 million in value, though she couldn't access them pending the divorce proceedings. The real cost was harder to calculate. Every hour after the scandal, the company lost $7.2 million in value. The $800 bottle of wine had destroyed $6.5 million per drop. What Victoria didn't know yet was that the wine itself held a secret. Chateau Margaux, 1995, the year James Whitmore had quietly adopted a broken boy and given him a future. Table 7, where she'd humiliated David, was where James had suffered his fatal heart attack a decade ago to the day. And Margaret, the server she'd fired, had been James's nurse during his final hours. He'd made her promise something before he died. If you ever see a man named David Marshall in trouble, protect him. Margaret had taken a job at that gala for one reason only. Richard spent the afternoon searching for David Marshall. He found a Boston address, a small apartment in Brooklyn Heights. An unremarkable life for a man who held 15 patents and controlled $1 billion decision. He found the article about St. Grace again and stared at it, a sick feeling growing in his stomach. His father had loved that orphanage, had visited it regularly, had never explained why. In a locked drawer, Richard found a small wooden box he'd never had the key to open. He called a locksmith. Inside were 47 photographs spanning 4 decades, a boy growing into a man. David Marshall at 8, at 15, at 25, at 40. Every photo had a note in his father's handwriting. My proudest achievement. The son I chose. He made it. Beneath the photos was a letter dated 4 days before James Whitmore died. It began, Richard, my son, if you're reading this, I'm gone. There's something I never told you. Victoria sat on the bathroom floor of her $12 million mansion, arms wrapped around her knees, phone face down on the marble tile. She couldn't look at it anymore. 15,000 messages. most of them wishing her dead. 200 emails threatening violence. The internet had become a mob, and she was their target. She hadn't slept in 36 hours. Her hands shook, her head pounded. When she looked in the mirror, she didn't recognize the woman staring back, eyes sunken and ringed with dark circles. Lips cracked, skin pale as paper. She tried to eat but couldn't keep anything down. The refrigerator was full of expensive foods she'd ordered from specialty markets. But the thought of eating made her stomach turn. She'd lost 3 pounds in 24 hours. Her wedding ring hung loose on her finger. On the second day, she ventured out to a Starbucks 3 blocks from her home. She needed coffee, needed to feel normal for just a moment. She pulled her credit card from her wallet, Black American Express, no limit, and handed it to the barista. The machine beeped, declined. She tried again. Declined. The barista looked at her with dawning recognition. "You're the wine lady," someone whispered from the line behind her. Victoria left without the coffee, walking quickly past people who stopped to stare and pull out their phones. By the third day, Victoria understood what it meant to be truly alone. Richard was sleeping at his office. Emma had blocked her number. Her friends, the women she'd had lunch with, attended galas with, vacationed with, had gone silent. Not one had called. Not one had texted to ask if she was okay. She stood on her bedroom balcony on the 12th floor and looked down at the Manhattan street below. It would be so easy. 3 seconds and everything would stop. No more messages. No more shame. No more seeing her own face on television. Frozen in that moment of cruelty. But something stopped her. A memory she couldn't quite grasp, like a dream fading at dawn. A child's voice saying thank you. The smell of old bread, a boy's face, blurred by time. She stepped back from the balcony and went to her closet. In the back corner, hidden behind evening gowns and designer shoes, was a small cardboard box she hadn't opened in 40 years. Her hands trembled as she lifted the lid. Inside was a photograph of a 9-year-old girl with short cropped hair and sad eyes, wearing a donated dress 2 sizes too big. Martha Hayes, ward of the state. Beneath the photo was a small gray stone, smooth and unremarkable. And beneath that was a piece of yellowed paper with child's handwriting. Martha and David, 1978. Hope never dies. Victoria sank to the floor, clutching the stone. The memory came flooding back like a dam breaking. A boy with kind eyes giving her half his bread when she was starving. His voice, sisters and brothers in hardship stick together. She remembered crying, remembered saying thank you over and over, remembered feeling seen for the first time in her life. And she remembered his name. David. She pulled out her phone with shaking hands and searched David Marshall, St. Grace. The results loaded slowly, painfully. There was the article from years ago. There was a photo of a man in his 30s. She zoomed in on his face, trying to match it to the boy from her memory. Was it him? Could it be? She dialed the only person she thought might help. Margaret answered on the 3rd ring. "Mrs. Whitmore." "Margaret, please, I know you knew that man. I need to find him. I need to apologize." There was a long silence. Finally, Margaret said, "Meet me at St. Grace tomorrow, 2 in the afternoon." The line went dead. Richard Whitmore hadn't left his father's office in 3 days. He'd suffered a mild angina attack on the 2nd day, stress-induced chest pain that sent shooting agony down his left arm. He took medication and told no one. The company was hemorrhaging money and reputation. The board was demanding action. Partners were fleeing. And now this letter. He read it again, each word cutting deeper than the last. Richard, my son, if you're reading this, I'm gone. There's something I never told you. I have another son. His name is David Marshall. I found him in 1982, a broken boy who lost everything in a fire. I gave him a chance, and he gave me purpose. I kept him secret not because I'm ashamed of you, but because I wanted to give him freedom to be himself. Not James Whitmore's charity case. Find him. Tell him pride comes before the fall, but humility builds empires. That's the legacy I want you both to carry. If 10 years pass and you haven't found David, my $500 million charity fund will go to the St. Grace Orphanage Foundation. Don't let that happen. Find your brother, Dad. The letter was dated just days before James had died. Richard calculated quickly. His father had died 10 years ago. The deadline was approaching. Less than a year remained. But what struck him harder than the timeline was the emotion in those words. His father had called David "my son" with such warmth. Richard couldn't remember the last time his father had spoken to him with that kind of tenderness. He spread the 47 photographs across his desk. David as a child, skinny and haunted. David as a teenager, starting to smile. David graduating from college in a cheap suit. James standing beside him beaming. David at 28 receiving some kind of award. James in the audience. His father had documented this man's entire life, while Richard had barely seen him twice a year. Jealousy burned in Richard's chest, hot and shameful. His father had given this stranger what he'd never given his own son: unconditional love. But beneath the jealousy was something else. Grief. His father had died with this secret, had wanted desperately to connect his two sons, and had run out of time. Richard researched David Marshall obsessively. 15 patents in defense technology, chief engineer at TechCore Defense, respected, brilliant, living modestly in Brooklyn. And there it was in a small news article. Marshall recently underwent treatment for pancreatic cancer and is on medical leave. The man was dying. The man his wife had humiliated. The man who'd withdrawn a $1 billion contract. The man his father had loved like a son was dying. And Richard had less than a year to fulfill his father's last wish. He booked a flight to Boston for the next morning. Emma Whitmore sat in her grandmother's guest room, staring at her phone. The video of her mother had 50 million views now. The comments were vicious. But what haunted Emma more was what her grandmother had just told her. "Your mother wasn't always like this," Marianne Hayes said, her 78-year-old hands folded in her lap. "She was a sweet child when we adopted her. Martha, that was her name before we changed it. She'd lived in that orphanage for 4 years. 40 children in one room, eating donated food, wearing hand-me-downs. When we brought her home, she cried for a week because she had her own bedroom. Mom was an orphan." Emma's voice cracked. "We thought we were helping her. We gave her everything: private schools, music lessons, a new name, a new identity. But we also taught her to forget. My husband, God rest him, he used to say, 'The past is the past. Victoria, you're one of us now.' We didn't mean to make her ashamed of where she came from. But I think that's what happened." Emma looked at the old photograph her grandmother had given her. Martha Hayes, 9 years old, thin and frightened. Standing in front of a brick building with a small sign that read, St. Grace Orphanage, this scared little girl had become the woman who poured wine on a stranger's head. She pulled out a notebook and began to write a letter she wouldn't send. Mom, I know you're hurting, but I can't forgive you yet. You taught me to be strong, but you never taught me to be kind. I saw you pour that wine, and I saw myself in you the way I talk about kids at school who aren't as rich as me, the way I judge people by their clothes. I'm scared I'll become you. I need time to figure out who I want to be. She folded the letter and put it in her drawer, next to the photograph of Martha. David Marshall sat in his small Brooklyn apartment, the gray vest hanging on the back of a chair, still stained with wine. He'd tried to wash it, but the red had set too deep. He'd been wearing the only thing that connected him to James Whitmore, and now it was ruined. He ran his finger over the embroidered words inside the collar. James had sewn them with his own hands, awkwardly, lovingly. It had taken him 3 months to make this vest because he wasn't good with needles and thread, but he'd insisted on doing it himself. A father should make something for his son with his own hands, he'd said. David had worn this vest to every important moment of his adult life, his PhD defense, his first patent approval, the day he became chief engineer, and now, to what he'd hoped would be a memorial to the man who'd saved him. Instead, it had become evidence of how far James's company had fallen. His phone buzzed. An email from TechCore's legal department confirming his withdrawal from the contract. Another email from a journalist requesting an interview. 17 missed calls. He ignored them all. Instead, he drove to the cemetery where James was buried. It was raining, cold drops that soaked through his jacket. He knelt in front of the headstone, placed the wine-stained vest on the wet grass. Mr. James, he said quietly, I kept my promise. I stayed humble. I stayed kind. But it cost everything. I hope you're proud. He pressed his forehead against the cold marble and cried for the first time since James had died. 10 years and 3 days ago. He cried for the father he'd lost. He cried for the little girl named Martha who'd said thank you 17 times and then disappeared from his life. He cried because he was dying and he'd be leaving this world just as alone as he'd entered it. The rain washed the wine from the vest, turning the grass around it pink. David stayed there until the groundskeeper told him they were closing the gates. He left the vest behind, draped over James's headstone like a flag of surrender. Richard Whitmore sat in his father's office, the letter trembling in his hands. He'd read it 20 times in the past hour, and each reading cut deeper. His father had another son, a son he'd chosen, rescued, loved in ways Richard had never experienced. The jealousy was a physical ache in his chest, but beneath it lay something more complicated, a desperate need to understand the man who'd raised him from a distance, while embracing a stranger with open arms. The 47 photographs spread across the mahogany desk told a story Richard had never been part of. David Marshall growing from a haunted 8-year-old into a man of quiet dignity. His father had been there for milestones Richard didn't even know about. Graduations, awards, birthdays, perhaps. All documented, all treasured, all kept secret. The letter mentioned a deadline. James had died exactly 10 years and 3 days ago. If Richard didn't find David and fulfill his father's wishes within 10 years, $500 million would transfer to the St. Grace Orphanage Foundation. The deadline was less than a year away. 362 days. But the money didn't matter. What mattered was the last thing his father had wanted for his two sons to know each other. To carry forward a legacy of humility over pride. And Richard had already failed. His wife had humiliated the brother he'd never met. The company was in shambles. Everything his father had built was crumbling. He searched for David Marshall's address and found it surprisingly easily. A modest two-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn Heights, a neighborhood that was nice, but nowhere near the luxury Richard was accustomed to. The chief engineer of a major defense contractor, a man who controlled billion-dollar decisions, lived like a graduate student. Richard didn't call ahead. He couldn't risk David refusing to see him. He booked a flight to New York that night and tried to sleep on the plane, but his mind wouldn't stop racing. What would he say? How do you apologize for your wife destroying someone's dignity? How do you explain that you just found out your brothers? At dawn, he stood outside David's building, staring up at the third-floor windows. The building was old, but well-maintained, with flower boxes in some windows and bicycles chained to the railings. He climbed the stairs slowly, his heart pounding harder with each step. When he knocked, there was a long pause. Then the door opened, and Richard found himself face to face with a man who looked far older than 57. David was thin, too thin, with shadows under his eyes and a hollowness to his cheeks that spoke of serious illness. But his eyes were clear and calm. And when he saw Richard, something flickered across his face. Recognition, maybe. Or resignation. "You're James's son," David said. It wasn't a question. "And you're my brother," Richard replied, his voice breaking on the last word. David stepped aside to let him in. The apartment was sparse but clean. One photograph on the wall, James and David at a college graduation, both grinning widely, a desk covered in technical papers and books. A small kitchen with a coffee maker and not much else. This was the home of a man who lived for his work, not his comfort. Richard pulled the letter from his jacket pocket. "He wanted me to find you. He wrote this before he died." David took the letter with shaking hands. As he read, tears streamed down his face, dripping onto the paper and making the ink run. When he finished, he looked up at Richard with raw grief in his eyes. "I never knew he wrote this," David whispered. "He died before telling me about you. I thought I was alone." "Why did you withdraw the contract?" Richard asked. "It could have been our future together." David walked to the window and stared out at the Brooklyn skyline. "Because your wife reminded me of the worst part of humanity. Looking down on others because of how they dress, where they sit, who they appear to be. Your father spent 32 years teaching me the opposite. He taught me that dignity isn't something you wear, it's something you give to others. I couldn't betray that lesson. Not even for $1 billion. She's not who you think," Richard said quietly. "She's broken. Like all of us. Your father used to say, 'Pride comes before the fall, but humility builds empires.' I've lived by that, but watching your wife pour wine on me, I realized the world doesn't care about humility anymore." "Then teach us," Richard said. "Teach me how Dad saw the world. I want to build what he dreamed of." David turned to face him, and Richard saw how sick he really was. The gray pallor of his skin, the way he leaned slightly against the wall for support. "I'm dying. Richard, pancreatic cancer, stage 4. The doctors say 6 to 8 months. How can I teach anything?" The words hit Richard like a physical blow. 6 months is enough to change a legacy. David studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Maybe. But first, you need to know something about your father, and about me. He told Richard everything. The church fire when he was 8, carrying his 3-year-old sister Emily out of the flames, only to lose her anyway, holding her small body for 7 hours until someone found him. Too shocked to cry, too broken to feel. The years at St. Grace Orphanage, sleeping in a room with 40 other children, eating donated food, wearing clothes that didn't fit. There was a girl, David said softly. Martha. She was 9. Scared, being bullied. I gave her half my bread because it was all I had to give. She cried and thanked me 17 times. I carved our names on a wall. Hope never dies. I wanted her to believe it. Richard felt something shift in his chest. Martha Hayes. That was my wife's name before she was adopted. David's head snapped up. What? She was from St. Grace, too. She changed her name when she was adopted by a wealthy family. For a long moment, neither man moved. Then David crossed to a small desk and pulled out a folder. Inside were news clippings, articles, research. I looked for her for years after I left St. Grace. I wanted to know she was okay. I found out she'd been adopted, that she'd gotten a good life. I was happy for her. I never thought. He trailed off, shaking his head in disbelief. I never thought I'd see her again. And when I did, she didn't recognize me. She forgot, Richard said. She forgot everything about that place. Her adoptive family taught her to leave it behind. David pulled out his phone and showed Richard a photograph he'd taken years ago of a wall at St. Grace. Carved into the old brick were childish letters, Martha and David, 1978. Hope never dies. I carved that for her, David said, so she'd know she mattered. Richard's phone buzzed. A text from Victoria. I'm at St. Grace. I found something. I need to tell you. He put the phone on speaker. Victoria. I'm here with David Marshall. There was a sharp intake of breath. Then, her voice shaking. Richard, I was at St. Grace. I found a wall with my name and his name. We knew each other. 46 years ago, I forgot him. I forgot everything. David's hand went to his chest. And for a moment, Richard thought he might collapse. Martha, you're Martha Hayes. Yes. Victoria's voice broke. I'm Martha. I changed my name. I ran from my past. And I hurt you. I hurt the one person who saved me. David closed his eyes. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible. Martha, I've been looking for you for 46 years. The phone fell silent. 3 people, connected by a thread of memory and loss, trying to comprehend what had just been revealed. Richard looked at the photograph of the carved wall, at David's stricken face, at his phone where his wife was presumably falling apart. Everything had changed. The scandal, the contract, the company, all of it suddenly seemed small compared to this. His father had known. James Whitmore had known that his adopted son and his daughter-in-law both came from the same orphanage. He'd known they'd known each other as children. And he'd kept the secret, waiting for them to find each other again. The question was why Richard thought about the letter again. Find your brother. Tell him pride comes before the fall. But humility builds empires. His father had been setting something in motion, even from beyond the grave. A test, perhaps, or a gift. a chance for redemption. "We need to meet," Richard said into the phone. "All three of us. Tomorrow, at St. Grace." "I'll be there," Victoria whispered. David nodded, tears streaming down his face. "I'll be there. Martha." When the call ended, Richard and David sat in silence. Finally, Richard asked the question that had been burning in his mind. "Did my father love me?" David looked surprised. "Of course he did. He talked about you constantly. He was so proud of you running the company. But he was gentle with you. I saw it in his letters, in the photos. He was different with you. He was harder on you because he trusted you to carry the weight." David said, "He was gentle with me because I had nothing left to lose. You were his duty and his pride. I was his choice and his hope. Different kinds of love. Richard, not better or worse. Just different." Richard found himself crying for the first time since his father's funeral. David crossed the room and put a hand on his shoulder. And the two men who were strangers and brothers wept together for the father they'd both loved and lost. The morning sun filtered through David's apartment windows, casting long shadows across the worn hardwood floors. Richard had stayed the night, neither man wanting to break the fragile connection they'd just discovered. They sat at David's small kitchen table, drinking coffee from mismatched mugs, trying to piece together a lifetime of missed moments. "Tell me about the fire," Richard said gently. "Tell me everything." David stared into his coffee for a long moment before speaking. "I was 8 years old. My parents took me and my sister Emily to Sunday service at St. Michael's Church. Emily was 3, with blonde curls and a laugh that sounded like bells. She was afraid of the dark, so I always held her hand." His voice was steady, but his hands trembled slightly around the mug. The fire started in the basement, in the electrical room. Old wiring, the investigators said later. It spread so fast. One moment we were singing hymns. The next there was smoke everywhere. People were screaming, pushing toward the exits. I grabbed Emily and ran. Richard watched David's face, saw the boy he'd been still trapped in that moment. I got her out the side door. The fresh air hit us, and I thought we were safe. But she wasn't breathing right. She'd inhaled too much smoke. I held her on the grass, crying, begging her to wake up. She died in my arms 20 minutes later while we waited for the ambulance. The paramedics tried to revive her, but it was too late. Your parents, they didn't make it out. I was told later that my father had gone back in to help an elderly woman. My mother followed him. They found their bodies together near the altar. David's voice cracked. I held Emily's body for 7 hours. I wouldn't let anyone take her from me. I didn't cry. I didn't speak. I just held her and stared at nothing. They finally sedated me to get her away from me. Richard felt tears on his own cheeks. "David, I'm so sorry. They sent me to St. Grace because I had no other family. For 3 years, I barely spoke to anyone. I just existed. Fixed broken things around the orphanage electrical outlets, door hinges, anything with my hands. It was the only way I knew how to cope. And then you met Martha." David's expression softened slightly. "She arrived when I was 11. This tiny girl with enormous, frightened eyes, clutching a torn, stuffed bear. Some of the older kids bullied her immediately, took her food, shoved her, called her names. I saw her crying in the corner at dinner, and something in me woke up. I couldn't save Emily, but maybe I could help this little girl. He pulled out his phone and showed Richard a photograph of an old brick wall. Carved in childish letters were the words, Martha and David, 1978. Hope never dies. I carved that with a nail I found, David said. Took me 3 days. I wanted her to know that even in that place, she mattered, that someone saw her, that hope was possible. She kept a stone, Richard said. I saw it once, years ago, in a box she thought was hidden. I never asked about it. I gave her that stone the day she was adopted. She was 13, and this wealthy family came to take her away. They looked at her like she was a project, not a person. But it was her chance at a better life. So I told her to go. I gave her the stone and made her promise to stay kind, to not let money change who she was inside. She forgot, Richard said quietly. Or she chose to forget. Survival takes many forms. David replied. The family that adopted her gave her everything except permission to remember. I understand why she became Victoria. I just wish she'd remembered the girl she used to be. They sat in silence for a while, the weight of all these revelations settling between them. Finally, Richard asked the question that had been burning in his mind since he'd read his father's letter. How did my father find you? David smiled, the first real smile Richard had seen from him. There was another fire, in the kitchen at St. Grace. Faulty stove. I was 15, and I was trying to fix the electrical panel with my bare hands when your father showed up. He was there to make a donation. He'd been supporting the orphanage for years. He saw me standing on a chair, rewiring the panel without any safety equipment. And he asked me what I thought I was doing. What did you say? I told him I was trying to help, that these kids needed a working kitchen, and I was the only one who knew how to fix it. He watched me for a minute, then said, You're going to be an engineer someday. I'll make sure of it. Richard leaned forward. Just like that. Just like that. He came back the next week with proper tools and safety equipment. Taught me how to do it right. We spent every Saturday together for the next year, him teaching me about circuits and systems, me soaking up every word. On my 16th birthday, he asked if I wanted to be adopted. I said yes, but he kept it secret. He said he wanted to give me a chance to succeed on my own merits, not as James Whitmore's charity case. He paid for my education, helped me get into MIT, but we agreed to keep our relationship private. I took his last name as my middle name, Marshall, his mother's maiden name. It was our compromise. David stood and walked to a small shelf, pulling down a worn notebook. He wrote me letters, every month for 30 years, even when we couldn't see each other often. He wrote, Listen to this one. From when I graduated MIT. David, I watched you walk across that stage today, and I've never been prouder of anything in my life. Not the company, not the money, not any deal I've ever made. You, a boy who lost everything and built himself into a man of dignity and brilliance. You are my greatest success. Richard's throat tightened. He never wrote me letters like that. He didn't need to. You saw him every day. You worked beside him. He showed his love for you differently through trust, through responsibility, through building something for you to inherit. Don't mistake his methods for lack of feeling. I'm not sure I believe that. David closed the notebook and looked Richard directly in the eye. When he was dying, do you know what his last words to me were? Take care of Richard. He'll need a brother when I'm gone. I kept you two apart too long. Fix that for me. I couldn't. I didn't know how to find you. And then he was gone. Richard buried his face in his hands. All these years. He'd thought his father was cold, distant, more interested in business than family. But James Whitmore had been orchestrating something larger, trying to bring together two broken boys, one by blood, one by choice, and run out of time. The contract, Richard said suddenly, lifting his head. Can it be saved? David returned to his seat, his expression becoming more guarded. I already nominated another company. The decision has been made. Then we've lost everything because of one moment of cruelty. No, David said firmly. You lost a contract, but you can still save the company. Change the culture. Be what your father wanted. That's worth more than $1 billion. But without that contract, we'll have to lay off 2,000 people. Partners are already fleeing. The stock can recover, David interrupted, if you make the right changes. Richard stared at him, confused. What are you saying? David pulled out his laptop and opened an email. I didn't just withdraw from the contract. Richard, I wrote a recommendation to the Pentagon. He turned the screen so Richard could read it. The email was dated the morning after the gala. It read, To whom it may concern, I am formally withdrawing TechCore Defense's partnership with Whitmore Industries for the current defense contract. However, I am also submitting a recommendation if Whitmore Industries can demonstrate genuine cultural transformation within 12 months, including termination of discriminatory leadership, implementation of comprehensive ethics training, and commitment to donate 10% of annual profits to charitable causes, I recommend they be reconsidered for future contracts of similar or greater value. Signed, David Marshall, Chief Engineer, TechCore Defense. Richard read it 3 times, his heart pounding. You gave us a chance. I gave you your father's legacy. A pathway back, but you have to earn it. Victoria has to go, and she already has. You have to restructure everything, and you have to mean it, not just as a business strategy, but as a real change in values. 12 months. Richard whispered. 12 months to prove that James Whitmore's company can still embody what he believed in. I'll monitor your progress. If you make genuine changes, I'll recommend you for a $500 million contract next year. It won't replace what you lost, but it's a foundation to rebuild on. Richard stood abruptly and pulled David into a tight embrace. Thank you. Thank you, brother. David returned the hug, and Richard felt how thin he'd become, how fragile. The cancer was eating him alive, and still he was offering grace to people who'd hurt him. Don't thank me yet, David said when they pulled apart. The hardest part is ahead. You have to become the kind of company that deserves a second chance. Richard's phone rang. Victoria. He glanced at David, who nodded, and Richard answered on speaker. Richard, I'm at St. Grace. Victoria's voice was ragged, like she'd been crying for hours. I found something. The wall where we carved our names. David and I knew each other. We were friends. He saved me when I was 9 years old, and I forgot him. I forgot everything about this place. David closed his eyes, fresh tears streaming down his face. Victoria, Richard said carefully, I'm here with David Marshall right now. He's listening. There was a sharp intake of breath. Then, barely audible, David, is it really you? David moved closer to the phone, his voice thick with emotion. Martha. Yes, it's really me. I'm so sorry. Victoria sobbed. I'm so sorry. You gave me bread when I was starving. You carved our names on the wall. You told me hope never dies. And I repaid you by humiliating you in front of hundreds of people. How can you ever forgive me? Because I remember the little girl who said thank you 17 times. David replied. I remember her kindness, her fear, her hope. That girl is still inside you. Martha, I know she is. I don't deserve your forgiveness. Forgiveness isn't about deserving. It's about choosing to remember the good over the bad. I choose to remember Martha, not Victoria. The question is, which one will you choose to be going forward? There was a long silence. Then Victoria said, I want to meet you, both of you. I want to look you in the eye and apologize properly, and I want to try to become Martha again. I don't know if I can, but I want to try. Tomorrow, David said, at St. Grace. We'll meet where it all began. I'll be there, Victoria whispered. And David, I kept the stone. I kept it for 42 years. I never knew why. But I couldn't throw it away. David's hand went to his heart, and he smiled through his tears. Because hope never dies. Martha, even when we forget, hope remembers. When the call ended, Richard and David sat in silence, both overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just happened. 3 people whose lives had intersected 46 years ago, torn apart by circumstance and choice, brought together again by scandal and revelation. My father planned this, Richard said suddenly. He knew you were both from St. Grace. He knew you'd known each other. He brought you together through me. David nodded slowly. He always said he believed in redemption. I think this was his final gift to all of us. A chance to heal. The ruins of St. Grace Orphanage stood like a monument to forgotten childhoods. The building had been closed for 20 years. Windows broken, ivy crawling up the brick walls, the sign barely legible. Victoria arrived first, parking her car on the cracked asphalt and staring at the place she'd spent 4 years trying to forget. Her hands trembled on the steering wheel. She'd driven here alone, without makeup, wearing jeans and a simple sweater clothes she hadn't worn in decades. The woman who'd poured wine on a stranger at a charity gala felt like someone else entirely. Or maybe, she thought, that woman was who she'd become. And the frightened 9-year-old inside this building was who she'd always been. Margaret was waiting by the entrance, her elderly face kind but serious. Mrs. Whitmore, she said quietly. Please call me Martha. Victoria replied, her voice breaking. Victoria was a lie I told myself for too long. They walked inside together, their footsteps echoing in the empty halls. Dust motes danced in the sunlight, streaming through broken windows. The smell was different mold and decay instead of industrial soap and boiled vegetables, but the bones of the place remained. The long corridor, the dining hall with its scarred tables, the dormitory where 40 children had slept in bunk beds arranged in neat rows. Victoria stopped in the doorway of the dormitory, her breath catching. She could almost see them, the ghosts of children who'd lived here, slept here, cried here. She walked slowly to a corner of the room, to a specific wall, and there it was. Carved deep into the old brick, Martha and David, 1978. Hope never dies. She traced the letters with shaking fingers, and the memories crashed over her like a wave. His face, the boy with sad eyes who'd given her bread, who'd protected her from bullies, who'd carved these words with a rusty nail over 3 days because he wanted her to know she mattered. "I forgot him," she whispered. "How could I forget him?" "Because remembering hurt too much," Margaret said gently. "Sometimes we bury the past to survive it." The sound of footsteps made Victoria turn. Richard entered first, his expression carefully neutral, and behind him came David Marshall. Victoria's knees nearly buckled. He was thinner than at the gala, the illness more visible in the daylight. But it was his eyes that broke her, those same sad, kind eyes from 46 years ago, now set in a face lined with pain and time. He was the boy who'd saved her, and she'd destroyed him. "David," she breathed, the name foreign and familiar on her tongue. He walked toward her slowly, and Victoria instinctively took a step back, shame flooding through her. But he didn't stop. He came close enough that she could see the tears in his eyes. And then he did something she didn't expect. He smiled. "Hello, Martha," he said softly. The sound of her real name from his lips shattered the last of her composure. She fell to her knees, sobs tearing from her chest. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. You gave me everything when we were children, and I repaid you with cruelty. I don't deserve your forgiveness. I don't deserve to even speak to you." David knelt beside her, his movements careful. And that's when she saw it. He was looking at her left wrist, at the scar she always kept hidden beneath bracelets. His hand reached out slowly, asking permission, and when she didn't pull away, he touched the scar with gentle fingers. "The camp stove," he said. "You were trying to cook for the younger kids. You burned yourself. And you didn't cry, even though I knew it hurt terribly. You just wrapped it in a dishcloth and kept cooking." Victoria stared at him, astonished. "You remember that?" "I remember everything, Martha, every moment we spent together. You were kind and brave, and you said thank you 17 times when I gave you half my bread because you couldn't believe someone would share with you." The memories flooded back with painful clarity. Being 9 years old, newly arrived at St. Grace, terrified and alone. The older children who'd mocked her ragged clothes and missing parents, crying herself to sleep every night on a thin mattress. And then David, 11 years old, but seeming so much older, so much wiser, appearing beside her at dinner with half a sandwich. "Sisters and brothers in hardship stick together," Victoria whispered, remembering his words. "You remembered," David said, his voice thick with emotion. "I forgot your face. I forgot your name. But those words, they stayed with me my whole life. I just didn't remember where they came from." Richard stood back, watching the reunion with tears streaming down his face. Margaret moved quietly to his side and handed him a small envelope. "Your father asked me to give you these," she said. "If the three of you ever came together." Richard opened the envelope and found 2 letters inside, addressed to David and Victoria respectively. He handed them out silently. David's hands shook as he opened his letter and read aloud. "David, my son, if you're reading this, you found Martha. I knew she became Victoria Whitmore through marriage to another family. I knew you never forgot her. I didn't tell you because I wanted you to forgive her naturally, not out of obligation. True forgiveness cannot be forced. She ran from her past. You embraced yours. You're both survivors, just different paths. Love her like you loved the little girl who cried 17 times. She's still there. buried deep. Dad. Victoria's letter was shorter, but equally devastating. She read it through tears. Martha, I know you're scared. Scared someone will find out you were poor, abandoned, broken. But poverty is not shame. It's proof you survived. David never forgot you. He looked for you for years. When I found him, he asked me to help find a girl named Martha from St. Grace. I did. I found you living with the Ashfords. You looked happy. So I kept the secret. But I always hoped you'd remember the boy who gave you bread. I hope you find your way back to the girl who said thank you 17 times. James Whitmore. He knew. Victoria's voice was barely audible. He knew we knew each other. He orchestrated this. Richard said, everything. The gala was at the hotel where he died. On the anniversary of his death. He must have known David would come to honor his memory. He knew you'd be there representing the company. He set this in motion from beyond the grave. Victoria looked at David with fresh horror. You came to honor James Whitmore's memory, and I humiliated you in the place where he died. Yes, David said simply. But maybe that's what needed to happen. Maybe we needed a break before we could heal. I don't understand. How can you be so kind after everything? Because your father-in-law taught me something. David interrupted gently. He taught me that people are more than their worst moments, that everyone deserves a second chance, and that forgiveness is not about forgetting the pain, it's about choosing not to let it define us. Victoria noticed David wasn't wearing a watch and remembered him having nothing valuable at the gala. At the charity event, everyone wore expensive watches, Rolexes, designer brands. You weren't wearing one, I thought. I thought you were poor. David's expression softened with sad understanding. I sold my watch 3 years ago. It was a gift from James, a $50,000 Patek Philippe he gave me when I earned my doctorate. But after he died of a heart attack, I sold it and donated the money to the American Heart Association. I wanted to save others like him. The revelation hit Victoria like a physical blow. You sold a $50,000 watch to help others. I sold everything that wasn't essential. My nice car, my furniture, anything valuable. I donated 80% of my salary to the scholarship fund for orphans. I live in a small apartment because I don't need much. The vest I wore to the gala, the one you ruined with wine, was the only thing I kept because James made it with his own hands. It took him 3 months because he wasn't good at sewing. But he insisted. A father should make something for his son with his own hands. He said. Victoria's face crumpled. I destroyed the only thing you had left of him. No, David said firmly. You stained it. Stains can be cleaned, just like mistakes can be forgiven. He reached into his bag and pulled out the gray vest, now washed and carefully folded. The wine stains were faded, but still visible. He turned it inside out and showed her the embroidered words, DM, a son I chose, not by blood, but by heart. J. Guabu. Victoria touched the embroidery with trembling fingers, then pressed the vest to her face and wept. I've become everything you told me not to be. You said, stay kind. Don't let them change you. But I let them change me. I became cruel and shallow and everything I despised. Then change back, David said. It's not too late. Martha, you can choose who you want to be. Margaret stepped forward again, holding one more item. Your father also left this for you both. She handed Victoria a small wooden box. Inside was a photograph, yellowed with age. 2 children in the St. Grace dormitory, a girl of 9 with short hair and frightened eyes, and a boy of 11 with his arm protectively around her shoulders. On the back, in James Whitmore's handwriting, "Hope never dies. Found this in the orphanage records. These are the people you were meant to be." Victoria and David stared at the photograph. Seeing themselves as they'd been before life had hardened them, before loss and fear and survival instincts had built walls around their hearts. "I want to be here again," Victoria whispered, pointing at the little girl in the photo. "I want to be Martha, the girl who said thank you, the girl who cared about others. I don't know how, but I want to try." "Then start now," David said. "Right here, right now. Choose to be her." Victoria pulled the gray stone from her pocket, the one she'd kept for 42 years without understanding why. She held it out to David. "You gave me this when I left. You told me to keep it, to remember that someone believed in me. I never forgot it. Even when I forgot everything else, I kept this stone." David took the stone with reverence, turning it over in his hands. "You kept it. For 42 years, through 3 moves, 2 marriages, everything. I couldn't throw it away. It was the only piece of Martha I had left." David placed the stone back in her palm and closed her fingers around it. "Then keep it. Let it remind you of who you're becoming again." The 4 of them stood in that ruined dormitory, surrounded by ghosts and memories. And something shifted. The weight of secrets lifted. The burden of shame began to ease. It wasn't healing, not yet, but it was the beginning of healing. The first fragile steps toward redemption. Richard spoke for the first time in many minutes. "Dad wanted us to be family. All of us. Not by blood, but by choice." David nodded. "Then let's honor that. Let's build what he dreamed of." Victoria looked at the 2 men and the elderly woman who'd kept James Whitmore's secrets. "I don't deserve this, any of it. Deserving has nothing to do with it," Margaret said gently. "Grace is a gift. Child. You can't earn it. You can only receive it and pass it forward." As the afternoon sun slanted through the broken windows, the 4 people who'd been brought together by tragedy and scandal stood in a circle, holding hands. Martha and David, reunited after 46 years. Richard, the son learning his father's heart. Margaret, the faithful guardian of last wishes. Together, they bowed their heads in the ruins of St. Grace Orphanage and began the long work of healing. David's voice grew softer as he began to take them back through time. "Let me tell you how we really met. Martha, let me tell you the story you've forgotten." Victoria sat on the dusty floor of the dormitory, her back against the wall where their names were carved. Richard and Margaret settled nearby, and David began to speak, his words painting pictures of a past that had shaped them all. It was May of 1978. I'd been at St. Grace for 3 years by then. I was 11 years old, but I felt ancient. After the fire, after losing Emily and my parents, I stopped being a child. I just existed. Fixed broken things. Stayed quiet. Didn't let anyone close because losing people hurt too much. He closed his eyes, remembering. Then one night, a police car pulled up during dinner. We all stopped eating to watch because new kids didn't come often. Sister Mary brought in this tiny girl with enormous eyes, clutching a stuffed bear that was missing an ear. "You were so small. Martha, 9 years old, but you looked younger, like you might blow away in a strong wind. Victoria's hand went to her mouth. She could almost see it, the frightened child she'd been, standing in a room full of strangers. The other kids went back to eating, but I watched you. Sister Mary showed you to a bed number 23, and you sat there holding that bear, not crying, not speaking, just staring at nothing. I recognized that look. It was the same one I'd seen in the mirror for 3 years, the look of someone who'd lost everything. David's voice cracked slightly. The next morning at breakfast, 3 of the older kids, Sarah, Jake, and Tommy, they were the bullies of St. Grace. They targeted new kids, especially the scared ones. They saw you standing in line for food, and Sarah shoved you. You dropped your tray. Oatmeal went everywhere. And when you bent down to clean it up, Jake kicked your stuffed bear across the room. Victoria's eyes filled with tears. She remembered now. The shame of it. The cruelty. You didn't cry, David continued. You just picked up your bear and went to sit in the corner. No food, no tears. Just this quiet acceptance that this was how life would be. And something in me broke. I couldn't save Emily, couldn't save my parents, but maybe I could help you. He smiled sadly at the memory. That night, I gave you half my dinner, a piece of bread, some watery soup. You looked at me like I'd handed you gold, and you said thank you. Then you said it again, and again. 17 times in total. I counted because it was so unusual. Most kids at St. Grace learned not to trust kindness, but you hadn't learned that yet. I remember, Victoria whispered. You said, sisters and brothers in hardship stick together. My mother used to say that. It was one of the only things I remembered about her. And it felt right, saying it to you. We were family, all of us orphans, bound by loss if nothing else. David stood and walked to the window, looking out at the overgrown grounds. The bullying didn't stop. A week later, they found you in the bathroom and cut your hair while you slept. You woke up with chunks missing. Sister Mary had to cut it all short to even it out. You looked in the mirror and I saw something die in your eyes. I remember that too, Victoria said, touching her hair unconsciously. I cried for the first time since my parents died. I heard you. Your bed was across the room from mine. I heard you crying into your pillow, trying to be quiet so you wouldn't bother anyone. So I got up and sat on the floor next to your bed. I didn't say anything. I just sat there until you stopped crying. Richard listened, transfixed. This was a side of human connection he'd rarely witnessed, pure, uncomplicated kindness between 2 broken children. The next incident was worse. David continued, his jaw tightening. 2 weeks after you arrived, Sarah, Jake, and Tommy cornered you in the play yard. They pushed you down on the concrete. Your knees were bleeding, your hands scraped raw, and they stood there laughing. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. I was smaller than all 3 of them. I'd never been in a fight in my life. But I ran across that yard and I pushed Jake as hard as I could. He fell backwards, surprised, and I stood between you and them and I said, "Touch her again and I'll tell Sister Mary you're stealing food from the kitchen." That was true? Victoria asked. It was true. I'd seen them sneaking bread late at night. I'd never told because I didn't care. But I cared about protecting you. They knew I wasn't bluffing. They backed off. David returned to where Victoria sat and knelt beside her. I helped you to the bathroom and washed your scraped knees. You didn't cry this time. You just looked at me and asked, "Why are you being nice to me?" And I didn't have a good answer. I just said, "Because someone should be." Margaret dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. Even she, who'd heard countless stories from St. Grace, found this one particularly moving. After that, we were inseparable. David said, "You followed me everywhere, helped me fix things around the orphanage, even though you didn't know what you were doing. You just hand me tools and keep me company. You talked more then. Told me about your parents, your father who'd been a teacher, your mother who'd sung you to sleep, the car accident that took them both instantly." Victoria nodded, the memories flowing now like a river breaking through a dam. "You told me about Emily, about holding her while she died, about how you couldn't save her. And you said something I never forgot. You said, maybe you couldn't save her, but you tried. That's what matters. You were 9 years old, and you understood something about grief that most adults never learn." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a faded photograph, and the same one Margaret had shown them earlier, of 2 children with their arms around each other. "Sister Mary took this. We didn't know she was taking pictures that day. She said she liked to document the good moments, not just the hard ones." In the photo, Martha's head rested on David's shoulder. His arm was around her protectively. Both children looked at the camera with tentative smiles, as if they weren't quite sure happiness was allowed, but were trying it anyway. "That was taken the day before you burned your wrist on the stove," David said. "Do you remember what you were doing?" Victoria closed her eyes, and the memory came back in vivid detail. The younger kids were hungry. Sister Mary was sick in bed. I wanted to make them soup. You were 10 years old, and you were trying to feed 15 younger children because you couldn't stand to see them hungry. The stove was old, the burner faulty. It sparked and burned your wrist badly. You wrapped it in a dishcloth and kept cooking. When I found you, the cloth was soaked with blood. You carried me to the infirmary. Victoria remembered. You held my hand while Sister Mary bandaged it. You told me I was brave. You were brave. You are brave. That's the Martha I remember. The one who said thank you 17 times. The one who fed hungry children despite being in pain. The one who chose kindness even when the world had been cruel to her. David helped Victoria to her feet and led her to the wall where he'd carved their names. 2 weeks before you were adopted, you came to me crying. You said you was afraid you'd forget St. Grace. Forget everyone here. Forget that you'd ever been poor. The Ashfords had visited and made it clear they expected you to leave your past behind. Start fresh, new name, new identity, new life. I remember being terrified, Victoria said. Terrified of forgetting, but also terrified of remembering. Remembering hurt so much. So I took a nail from the workshop and I spent 3 nights carving these words into this wall. Martha and David, 1978. Hope never dies. I carved it deep so it couldn't be painted over or erased. I wanted proof that we'd existed, that we'd mattered, that we'd been real. His finger traced the carved letters. On your last day, we stood here together. I gave you the gray stone I'd found by the fence. You asked why a stone. I told you stones last forever. They don't break or fade or disappear. I wanted you to have something permanent. Something that would survive, even if memories didn't. You told me to stay kind, Victoria said, her voice breaking. You said, don't let them change who you are inside. No matter how much money they have, no matter how different your life becomes. Stay kind. Stay, Martha. And you promised you would, David said softly. You hugged me and said, I'll find you someday. And I said, I'll wait. Richard stood abruptly, overwhelmed by the weight of this history. You waited 46 years, he said to David. You never stopped looking for her? I looked for 5 years, David admitted. Asked James to help me search for Martha Hayes. He found her living with the Ashfords, newly renamed Victoria. He showed me a photo of you at a fancy school in a designer uniform, smiling in a way I'd never seen you smile at St. Grace. You looked happy. So I stopped looking. I thought you'd found your better life, and I didn't want to drag you back into painful memories. But I wasn't happy, Victoria said. I was performing, playing a role, being who they wanted me to be. I didn't know that. I just knew you were safe and cared for. And that was enough for me. I moved on with my life. Got my education. Built my career. But I never forgot you. Every time I helped an orphan through the scholarship fund, I imagined I was helping the 9-year-old girl who said thank you 17 times. Victoria turned to face him fully, tears streaming down her face. And then I poured wine on your head. I called you poor. I treated you like you were nothing. I became Sarah and Jake and Tommy. I became the bully. Yes, David said simply. But bullies can change. I've seen it happen. The question is, do you want to change? More than anything. Victoria whispered, I want to be Martha again. I want to be the girl who tried to feed hungry children. The girl who kept a stone for 42 years because someone told her hope never dies. I want to deserve your forgiveness. David took both her hands in his. Then you already have it. Because the Martha I knew would forgive me if I made a mistake. And I choose to be the David she knew, the one who believes in second chances. For both of us. They stood there in the ruins of St. Grace. 2 middle-aged people holding the broken pieces of their childhood selves, trying to put them back together. The afternoon light shifted, casting long shadows across the carved wall. 46 years had passed since a boy had carved those words for a frightened girl. But the words remained. And perhaps, Victoria thought, that meant hope really never dies. It just waits, patient and persistent, for us to remember it. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It happened in 8 months of deliberate, painful choices. In the first month, Victoria moved out of her mansion and into a small apartment in Brooklyn, 3 blocks from David's building. She donated $300 million, her entire personal fortune, to establish the James and David Memorial Fund. She took a job she'd never imagined for herself, director of the newly reopened St. Grace Orphanage, now converted into an educational center for underprivileged children. Richard watched his wife scrub floors, serve meals, tutor children who reminded her of the girl she'd been. She wore no jewelry, no designer clothes. Her hands became rough with work. She lost weight, but this time from honest labor rather than stress and starvation. And slowly, painfully, something shifted in her eyes. The hardness began to crack. Emma came to visit in the 2nd month. She stood in the doorway of St. Grace, watching her mother read to a group of 6-year-olds, and something in her broke. "Mom," she called softly. Victoria looked up, and for a moment neither moved. Then Emma crossed the room and fell into her mother's arms, both of them crying. "I'm proud of you," Emma whispered. "I'm so proud of you." By the third month, Whitmore Industries had implemented every change David had recommended. Richard fired the 3 board members who'd orchestrated the scandal. He established an ethics committee. He committed 10% of all profits to charitable causes, starting with education for orphans. The company began to stabilize. Stock prices slowly climbed. New partners emerged, drawn by the genuine transformation. But while the company healed, David grew sicker. In the 4th month, he was hospitalized twice. Pancreatic cancer was merciless. The treatments bought time but couldn't stop the inevitable. Victoria visited him every day, reading to him, bringing him reports of the children at St. Grace, reminding him that his belief in second chances had changed her life. "You're becoming Martha again," he told her during one visit, his voice weak but content. "I am Martha," she corrected gently. "I've always been Martha. I just forgot for a while." By the 5th month, David could no longer work. He spent most days in his small apartment, looking through the letters James Whitmore had written him over 30 years. Victoria would arrive each morning, help him eat breakfast, then sit with him while he shared stories of the man who'd saved them both in different ways. Richard brought business reports, asking David's advice even when they both knew he was too ill to process complex information. It wasn't about the business anymore. It was about honoring the promise James had made, bringing his 2 sons together. In the 6th month, the Pentagon contacted Richard. They'd been monitoring Whitmore Industries' transformation. David had written them a letter of recommendation, explaining the changes he'd witnessed. A new contract was approved, $500 million over 5 years. Not the billion they'd lost, but a foundation to rebuild upon. When Richard told David the news, the dying man smiled. "Your father would be proud." "Our father," Richard corrected. The 7th month brought both victory and devastating loss. The James and David Memorial Fund officially launched, promising 20,000 children full 4-year college scholarships over the next decade. St. Grace graduated its first class of students, 15 teenagers who'd been homeless a year earlier, now heading to universities across the country. But David's condition deteriorated rapidly. He moved to hospice care. The doctors said weeks, maybe days. Victoria practically lived at the hospice. She read to him, held his hand, reminded him constantly that he'd saved her twice, once with bread, once with forgiveness. Emma visited often, calling him Grandpa David, bringing him flowers and drawings from the younger children at St. Grace. In the 8th month, on a Tuesday morning, David opened his eyes and asked for his gray vest. Victoria had spent 3 months carefully cleaning and repairing it. The wine stains were gone. The fabric mended with tiny, careful stitches she'd learned to make at St. Grace. She'd even re-embroidered the words that had faded, "A son I chose, not by blood, but by heart." Richard and Victoria helped David sit up, though the effort exhausted him. They dressed him in the vest, and he looked at himself in a small mirror Victoria held up. "I look respectable," he said with a soft smile. "You've always been respectable," Victoria replied. "The vest just helps the rest of us see it." David asked for paper and pen. His hands shook terribly, but he managed to write a final letter. It took him an hour. stopping frequently to rest. When he finished, he folded it and handed it to Victoria. "Don't read it until after," he said. "Promise me." "I promise," she whispered. That afternoon, David asked them all to come close: Victoria, Richard, and Emma. Margaret arrived too, having never left his side for long since that day at St. Grace. "I need to say something," David said, his voice barely audible. Each word cost him tremendous effort. "Martha, you kept your promise. You found your way back to kindness. I'm so proud of you. Richard, you became the leader your father knew you could be. Emma, stay curious and compassionate. You're the future." He looked at Margaret. "Thank you for keeping James's secrets and for protecting me when I needed it." "It was my honor," Margaret said, tears streaming down her weathered face. David's breathing became labored. He reached for Victoria's hand with one of his own, Richard's with the other. Emma held his feet. They formed a circle around him. This family built not on blood, but on choice and forgiveness and second chances. "James," David whispered, looking toward the window where afternoon light streamed through. "I kept my promise. I stayed humble. I stayed kind." At 3:47 in the afternoon, exactly the time James Whitmore had died 10 years earlier, David Marshall took his last breath. The monitor flatlined with a long, steady tone that sounded like peace. Victoria pressed her forehead to his hand and wept. Richard stood with his hand on his brother's shoulder, silent tears tracking down his face. Emma climbed onto the bed and curled against David's side. This man she'd known for only 8 months, but who'd taught her more about goodness than anyone else in her life. They stayed there for an hour before calling the nurses. None of them wanted to let go. 3 days later, 500 people gathered for David's memorial service. Former orphans whose scholarships he'd funded, colleagues from Tech Corps Defense, children from St. Grace wearing their best clothes, strangers who'd seen the viral video and been moved by the story of forgiveness that followed. Victoria stood at the podium, wearing simple black, her hands clutching the letter David had written. She'd read it 100 times in 3 days, and each reading broke her heart anew. "David Marshall was my brother," she began, her voice steady despite the tears. "Not by blood, but by hardship. 46 years ago, he gave me bread when I was starving. He gave me hope when I was broken. He carved our names on a wall so I would know I mattered. And when I forgot him, when I hurt him in the worst possible way, he forgave me." She unfolded the letter with shaking hands. "He wrote this hours before he died. He asked me not to read it until after. I want to share it with you now." Her voice cracked as she read. "Martha, you were my first friend and my last. You taught me that kindness is worth giving even when the world is cruel. I died knowing you found your way back to the girl who said thank you 17 times. I'm proud of you. Keep the stone. Give it to someone who needs hope someday. Tell Richard our father would be proud of him too. And remember, hope never dies. It waits for us to remember it. Love, David." Richard spoke next. His eulogy focused on the brother he'd barely known, but had come to love deeply. He announced that Whitmore Industries would be renamed Whitmore Marshall Industries in David's honor. 10% of all profits would permanently support orphan education. Emma read a poem she'd written about a man who proved that family was something you chose, not something you were born into. The service ended with Margaret sharing one final secret. She produced a second letter from James Whitmore. This one addressed, to be opened at David Marshall's funeral. Richard read it aloud to the assembled crowd. If you're reading this, David is gone, and I hope he lived well. My greatest achievement wasn't building a company or making money. It was finding a broken boy and watching him become a man of extraordinary grace. David, thank you for letting me be your father. You made me better than I was. Take care of each other, Richard, Victoria, and all those David touched. That's how we defeat death. We carry each other forward. With love, James. 2 years passed. Whitmore Marshall Industries flourished with a market value of $12 billion. The company culture had transformed completely. Built on principles of humility and service, Richard remained CEO. But the ruthless business practices of the past were gone, replaced by ethical leadership. St. Grace Memorial Center educated 200 children annually, all tuition-free. The wall where David had carved "Hope Never Dies" was preserved behind glass, a reminder to every child who walked those halls that they mattered, that someone saw them. Victoria lived simply in her Brooklyn apartment, working 50 hours a week with the children. She'd reconnected fully with Emma, who was now studying social work in college, inspired by her mother's transformation. Victoria never returned to the mansion, never wore designer clothes again, never tried to be Victoria Whitmore. She was Martha Hayes, and that was enough. On the 2nd anniversary of David's death, Martha returned to the cemetery. She knelt at his grave, placed the gray stone on his headstone, and spoke quietly to David. It's been 2 years. I miss you every day, but I'm keeping my promise. I'm Martha again, the girl who says thank you, the girl who believes hope never dies. Thank you for waiting 46 years for me. I found my way home. She sat there for an hour, talking to him about the children at St. Grace, about Richard's latest charitable initiative, about Emma's plans to open a counseling center for foster children. The afternoon sun created long shadows across the cemetery, and for just a moment, Martha could swear she saw 2 shadows instead of 1, as if David was sitting beside her, listening, smiling, proud. She stood finally, touching the headstone one last time. The inscription read simply, David Marshall, son, brother, teacher, friend. Hope never dies. Walking back through the cemetery gates, Martha felt something she hadn't experienced in decades. Peace, not happiness exactly, but something deeper. The quiet contentment of knowing she was living as her truest self. The girl who'd carved her name on a wall with a boy who believed in her had finally come home. And somewhere, she believed, James and David were together, watching over the family they'd built across generations, bound not by blood, but by something stronger, grace, freely given and gratefully received. Hope never dies. It just waits, patient as stone, for us to remember it. Dear friend, if you're listening to this story right now, perhaps something in it touched your heart. Maybe you saw yourself in Victoria, running from a past that shaped you. Maybe you recognized David's quiet dignity, having lived a life of giving even when the world took from you. Or perhaps you understood Richard, trying to honor a parent's legacy while forging your own path. This story isn't just about 3 people who found their way back to each other. It's about all of us who've ever forgotten who we truly are beneath the layers we've built for protection. Victoria spent 30 years being someone she thought she needed to be, only to discover that the frightened 9-year-old girl inside her was exactly who she was meant to be all along. How many of us have done the same? We've climbed ladders, built careers, accumulated possessions, all while burying the simple truths that once defined us. David waited 46 years for a promise to be kept, and when it finally was, he had only months left to enjoy it. But those months mattered more than decades of waiting because they were authentic, real, built on truth rather than pretense. James Whitmore taught his sons something profound. Pride comes before the fall. But humility builds empires, not empires of money or power, but empires of connection, meaning, and love that outlast us. The greatest inheritance we can leave isn't wealth. It's the values we pass forward, the kindness we show when no one's watching, the forgiveness we offer when we've been wronged. Martha kept a gray stone for 42 years without knowing why. Sometimes we hold on to things, people, or memories, because our hearts know what our minds have forgotten. That stone represented hope, and hope has a way of surviving even our worst attempts to bury it. If you're carrying something from your past, some small treasure or memory you can't explain, maybe it's time to examine it. Maybe it's calling you back to who you were before the world told you who to be. The beautiful truth this story offers is that it's never too late. Victoria transformed at 55. David forgave after decades of searching. Richard discovered his father's heart 10 years after losing him. Second chances aren't just for the young. They're for anyone brave enough to choose differently today than they did yesterday. So here's what I want to ask you. Is there someone from your past you've been meaning to forgive? Is there a version of yourself you've been trying to find again? What would it take for you to choose hope today, right now, in this moment? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Share your story of second chances or the person who showed you unexpected grace. Your words might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today, because hope never dies. My friend, it just waits, patient as stone, for us to remember it. And when we do, everything changes.